Hi and welcome to True Crime with me, Emma Kenny. If you like crime and you like consistency, then I'm your girl. I release content every Wednesday and every Sunday at the same time. So if you haven't subscribed, take a moment to. Also, just to let you know, I now officially have a Patreon, which is mind-blowing because I love it. And if you want to support me over there, please do. You'll just get lots of random videos of me. Not necessarily crime related, I'm going to be honest, but I'll do like behind the scenes and I'll do extended versions, and I'm going to throw some extra bits and pieces in there, particularly when I release merch. So if you want to, the link's going to be below. The case today has left me as confused as can possibly be, if I'm honest. When I started researching this, I had a real bias. I've seen documentaries on it, and therefore I had just gone down a very clear route that this was a massive injustice. But when I've come to explore it further, I'm a little bit more conflicted. So go with me on this journey. Go with me on this journey, guys, and let me know what you think at the end of it. Do you think that there was a miscarriage of justice, or do you think that the killers got to go free? By the way, I don't actually have a view on this. I'm just trying to be as neutral as possible, just to say that. But I'd be really interested in your thoughts. So today I'm going to be looking at a case which, in all honesty, I could have spent around 3 months doing a YouTube channel on. But I've not got that long, so I'm going to have to kind of condense it. The research in itself has been extensive, but I could have researched a lot more because there is so much out there. And what I'm going to try to do is to outline the facts and the main players in the events that essentially unfolded so that you guys can be invited to investigate a bit further and reach your own conclusions if you want to. So let's go back to 1993, where I had an amazing perm. I think that one of the most important key themes there was that I did have an incredible spiral perm. It was a year in the UK where it was full of Britpop, but in the States it was pretty eventful as well. You had Bill Clinton becoming the 42nd president, the World Trade Center was bombed, and there was the infamous Waco siege, where I am so going to cover the Waco siege. David Koresh, all the things that surrounded that siege really, really interest me. But we're not talking about that today. We're talking about this. There was also a massive flood in Mississippi, the Great Flood along the Mississippi River. But what 1993 became particularly notable for was a crime that didn't just rock the local area in which it happened, it literally transfixed an entire nation. It involved the brutal killing of 3 8-year-old boys in West Memphis, Arkansas. Now this case, which literally 30 years after it happened, is still hitting the headlines because there is so much conflict that is considered within what happened and what played out. Because there are doubts about the 3 who were involved being guilty. So ultimately 3 guys were found guilty of this crime, but ultimately, were they actually responsible for it? They were teenagers at the time of the offence as well. So this really did change the course of 3 young men's lives forever. Now, the victims of this actual crime themselves were best friends. It's just so upsetting. I look back at when my children were 8. If any of you have got children, older or younger, you'll know what I mean. At 8 years of age, all they are about is play, adventure. Everything's about hope, potential. They're excited about Christmas and birthdays. You know, you live your life as a child at that point with this naivety and innocence. So whenever I think about children being murdered, there's always that provocation that I feel, that sense of how did anybody look to those children and wish to bring them any harm, let alone kill them? And these 3 boys were called Stevie Branch, Michael Moore and Christopher Byers. They were in the 2nd grade at Weaver Elementary School. They were also Boy Scouts together. And one of the things that really upsets me when I think about it is, because this is so reminiscent of childhood, one of the boys, Michael, just absolutely loved wearing his Scout uniform. He would wear it whenever he could, not even when he was going to the Scouts. He just loved looking that way. That makes me so sad because I've got kids And I remember what it was like when they got an outfit that they really enjoyed. You know, one of my children wanted to go to school in the Power Rangers outfit every single day. He even had an outfit where he walked around dressed as a Tyrannosaurus Rex. Let me tell you, it was a pretty incredible outfit. But it wasn't very helpful when walking because it was a very long tail. But you know what I'm saying? It's that sense of child's play, child's adventure. And there these three boys were, just connected, best friends, enjoying and living their best life. The last time that they were seen, they were riding the bikes into the area of the Robin Hood Hills. That was on May the 5th, 1993. Now, this area itself is ultra conservative. It's in the South's Bible Belt, and that was situated between a really busy interstate highway and a trailer park. Like most areas, there was a place that kids liked to go and hang out, and Robin Hood Hills was that place. It was a small wooded area. It meant that they could have loads of fun and adventure. Think back to your own childhood. That's what I used to do. I used to go and climb trees. I used to go and hang out by lakes. I used to get myself into all sorts of mischief, get sent out completely clean, come back looking like I'd spent the day rolling in mud with various cuts on my body. I can remember that as a child. So this is what the kids used to do. And like most places, you know, when it goes darker, it's also where youths congregate. It's where teenagers go to hang out. They went drinking there, they took drugs there. Think about your local park. Don't pretend that you don't know what I'm talking about. We all went to parks. We all sat on the climbing frame drinking cider. Is that just me? You know you did. Probably having a cigarette as well, if you were in my age group. But that's what happened. No biggie. That's what happens in those areas. Kids always need places to go. In the UK, we used to have youth centres, but then the government closed them all down, because that's what caring governments do, isn't it? They literally ruin society. Sorry, that's my political bias creeping in there. The alert when they went missing was first raised by Christopher's adoptive father. He was called John Mark Byers. His name's quite important because of the ramifications after the death and some of the intrigue around who did kill the children, just to put it out there. So that was early on the evening of the 5th, around 7 p.m, he set the alarm. He said that the boys hadn't returned and it was really unusual behaviour. And I think we have to remember these are 8-year-old boys. So all three of them not returning home, that's going to be a real cause for alarm. On one level, as a parent, you might feel more settled. You might be thinking to yourself, well, there's 3 of them. They're probably just hanging out late. But for the most part, we would know that if one had got injured, the other 2 would have gone and got help. It's unusual for 3 kids to get lost, right? So that alarm is sounded and it's taken quite seriously, and they start searching immediately. Preliminary search doesn't turn up anything. They can't find the boys anywhere. And this goes on through the night. I do not want to imagine where those parents are psychologically. I have lost my child for maybe 1 minute in my life, and the panic that set in almost gave me a heart attack. And I mean that. We've all been in situations like that, haven't we, where you take your eye off your child for a minute and you can't see them for a second. Imagine knowing that your 8-year-old child is out in the dark. It's the worst nightmare. And then you can't help imagining that the worst is going to have happened. You live with that kind of constant dread as a parent, don't you? The next morning, Crittenden County Search and Rescue gets involved. They start heading this police search, and they obviously are going to go where kids tend to go. So they go to Robin Hood Hills. They start searching, and it isn't long before a horrific discovery is made, and it is utterly horrific. And when you listen to the detectives, investigators and search that got involved, they say that this is a case that stains their memory. They have never, ever forgotten the impact of what they found, and I completely understand why. So within this wooded area that they're searching, there's a secluded spot, and it's called Devil's Den. Horrible name, but that's what it's called. It's really popular with kids, and the way that you actually get to it, you have to go across a makeshift bridge. It's basically like got an old drainage pipe, lengths of wood have been put there, and that stretches across some water which was called the 10-mile bayou, and basically that's how the kids would get there. Now from there, It's a relatively short walk over the brow of a small hill, and that drops down a really steep slope to this muddy ditch. And that is a ditch that drained into 10 Mile Bayou. At this point, whilst they're searching, one of them notices that a boy's black trainer is floating in the water, and that's going to draw their attention straight away, isn't it? They're looking for 3 boys, and here we have a trainer floating suspiciously in the water. They start probing, they start poking into the water. Obviously, they're going to be feeling around, aren't they? And it's at that point they make the most horrific discovery. All 3 bodies of the missing boys. But it's not like they just find these boys drowned. You know, it's not like some horrible accident. It's clear from the get-go that these children have met the most brutal end. These children, all 3 of them, from immediately looking at their bodies, brutally beaten. Entire bodies, they were covered in bruises and cuts. But what was really disturbing was the way that the boys were actually found, the positions that they were found in. They'd all been stripped naked. They'd been hog-tied. Which appeared to be with their own shoelaces. Now, when you think about hog-tied, you tend to think, don't you, that the hands and the feet are tied together separately. That's not what they did. Instead, they'd got their hands and they tied them to their ankles. So the right hand was tied to the right ankle and the left hand was tied to the left ankle, meaning that the legs had been forced really wide apart. Imagine how sickening that would be to find. These are children, these are 8-year-old boys. It was also clear straight away that one of the children had been mutilated. Christopher had been crudely castrated. They'd sliced his scrotum off and they degloved his penis in the process. What was going on in the killer's minds? These are 8-year-old boys. Was he alive when they were doing that? Was he alive to deal with that excruciating pain, that torture? Just chills me to the bone. When the coroner looks at the bodies later on, one of the things that he concludes as well is that all 3 of the boys' anuses were dilated, and that suggests that they've been raped. I'm going to bring in now, because it's really important that I'm neutral, when the expert testimony was eventually given, they also confirmed that such dilation is actually a common side effect of rigor mortis, especially when the body has been left in water. So even though they initially believed that the boys had been raped, they couldn't quantify that that was actually true. Even though they believed that they'd been sodomized, they couldn't prove it because of this conflicting potential. We have to say that. One of the reasons that we know that killers place their victims in water is because if you want to get rid of forensics, if you want to make it much more difficult to figure out how somebody died, if you put them in water, that will do that. I'm not trying to give you tips, guys. I'm not like, just get my notepad out, right, puncture lungs, way down in water, gets rid of all forensic evidence. I'm not trying to do that. I'm just saying it happens to be a problem with forensics. Another reason that they thought there was a sexual assault was because of the injuries to the boys' ears and the side of their mouths. Just think about that. If you're an adult and you're forcing a child to give you oral sex, then the way that you hold behind their ears to force them is going to create some bruising, maybe some cuts, and also the damage in the mouth, because obviously they've got small mouths. So they could see that, and it looked like they had been forced to perform oral sex. As they carry on searching, they also notice a stick that's poking out from the water, and when they pull that out of the mud, they basically find that one of the boys' tops has been wrapped around the bottom of it. Now, they suspect, I can only tell you what they suspect, that this had basically been an attempt by the perpetrator to get rid of potential evidence. They believe that the stick itself may be length of a baseball bat, may have been one of the weapons that was used to beat the boys. They also found another couple of sticks that, again, they think were probably used to attack the boys with. Stevie, one of the other victims, had really severe injuries to his face. In fact, it appeared like a blade of a knife had been plunged through his entire face, so it was sitting through his cheek. He'd also been hit so forcefully on the back of his skull that it had been fractured in multiple places. And all 3 of them had suffered massive amounts of bruises, abrasions, cuts and lacerations. This was not a quick killing. This was a sustained and brutal and lengthy attack. So you have to imagine the mindset of a killer. I just want you to take that moment to just think, these are 3 8-year-old little boys. Imagine what it's like when you see a child fall and hurt themselves, the way they cry, the way they want the mama. It's just a natural reaction. Imagine what those boys were screaming and crying for in those moments. The pleading, the please, I won't tell anyone, please just want my mummy. And to be the people inflicting this kind of agony. Imagine being able to stand and witness and listen to those horrors, to hear those pleads, and to just carry on. In fact, to carry on with almost an enjoyment, because you must be enjoying it if you're consistently attacking each of these children. And how was each child feeling in those moments? Because were they attacking one at a time? Were those children waiting for their own doom? Imagine what that would have been like. 3 best friends made to witness the demise of one another. When they looked at the injuries, Michael and Christopher had over 60 separate injuries. Stevie had 20. Huge amount of injuries. So while Stevie had less injuries than the other 2, he died because he'd had a clear, sustained and brutal attack. And it also seems like they drowned in the ditch. So it was a combination of many injuries. I can't imagine what that scene would have been like. The small police force that were local to that area, way out of their depth. Completely out of their depth. Remember, this is a strong Bible Belt area. This stuff does not happen. This shit does not occur in these areas. Simple as. They are about domestic disputes, bike thefts, occasional violence, fights breaking out. They are not about multiple child homicide. And this is one of the big problems. You need the best forensic investigators. You need the top crime scene investigators to deal with this kind of experience. Why? Because if you're going to create a case, you better bet your bottom dollar that whoever's defending is going to get away with every technicality they can. If you do not look after that crime scene, then you are consequently putting yourself at risk of getting people who should be sent to prison off because of your negligence. And with retrospect, it was a massive problem. The police investigation itself gets horrendously criticised because crucial evidence is screwed up. They even don't know how to treat the suspects themselves. So again, because of that, vital pieces of evidence either have to get left out, or it can seem that actually the police were themselves trying to fit people up because they didn't handle the scene appropriately. You can imagine that at this moment in time, there is a huge media presence. This is the South's Bible Belt. The whole nation is shocked by this. 3 innocent children, 3 children murdered this way. They are out for blood. They are demanding justice. So the police are on a time frame issue here. Everyone's eyes are on them. They want to find who's guilty. Look, they want to find who's guilty. I'm not just going to say it as in the police just want to fit somebody up. That's not the case. I don't believe that for 1 minute. But you can imagine the pressure, can't you? 3 of the local children in this small area haven't just been murdered. They've been murdered, potentially sexually molested. They've been beaten to a pulp and drowned. The ramifications in that local area would be immense. These are people who think they know each other. So this is affecting every single human being who lives in that area. Children not being allowed to go out on the streets because the parents are afraid for their lives. Rightfully so. I wouldn't have my kids at all outside. I would be thinking, Jesus Christ, there is a serial killer in our midst. So the police are under pressure right now. They start investigating, and there is a name that keeps cropping up, and that's the name of Damien Echols. Now, Echols himself came from a really poor family. He hadn't had it easy, I'm going to be honest. He came from a trailer park in nearby Marion. There's a lot of prejudice against people who are poor. There's a lot of prejudice against people who have trailer park. You know, you're just going to think about when people use colloquialisms like trailer trash. So there's already a bias there, isn't there, about a particular person living in a particular place. The other thing is that he's known to police. He's been arrested for things like petty theft, shoplifting, burglary, and also it didn't help that he was a high school dropout. So he's 18 at this moment in time. The police know he's already been involved in criminal activity and obviously is not doing that well in society as far as stereotypically getting through his high school experience. Now, Echols has also, to add to that, been in a mental institution for some time. Like it or otherwise, people do have some prejudice, don't they? I mean, we can all pretend that they don't, but if you know that somebody's been in a mental institute, being involved in crime and is a dropout, you may have a bit of a bias towards them. You shouldn't, but it's just the nature of humanity. We are kind of a bit judgmental. On a survival level, it makes sense, doesn't it? The more you know about somebody, the more you can judge whether you feel safe around them. So you make these judgments to keep yourself safe. And he's somebody who's standing out because he's gone through these, shall we say, less stereotypical child-orientated experiences. It seems that when he was diagnosed, his mental illness was characterized by delusions, auditory and visual hallucinations, and severe mood swings. I mean, they are big classifications. You know, we're looking at potentially schizoaffective personality disorder, we're looking potentially at psychosis, we're looking potentially at schizophrenia. These are big deals, but obviously he'd been let out, so they must have managed them to some degree. Now, as these crimes occurred, there was also what we refer to in our trade as a satanic panic. It was basically sweeping the nation at this point, this idea that there were lots of people involved in the occult, doing ritualistic killings. And I'm going to put it out there, guys. Definitely, ritualistic killings happen. Definitely, there are Satanists. Absolutely, the Church of Satan exists today. And do I think that really dark shit happens? Yes, I do. Might not be popular to say. There might be a whole heap of people who are like, that's a conspiracy theorist. It's like, no, it isn't. We know it isn't, because the police know that they've investigated lots of satanic crimes. We know that ritualistic sacrifice is part of that. And so even though it's a horrible thing to imagine that people are involved in that kind of hideous practice, see you in the next lifetime when you're burning in hell with your dad. But the point is, it does happen. It's rare though. And at this point, it was very much like satanic panic was gripping the nation to the point where it was a little bit over the top. Because most deaths aren't. Even if people leave their personal signature and it happens to have like a devil sign in it, chances are they're not really actually involved in it. It's just wanting to make a mark. So I want to make it clear that I don't think that everybody was going about at that time murdering people in sacrifice to the devil. But nonetheless, this is kind of how it starts to play out, because the way the kids had been killed, it looked to some degree like there had been some kind of ritualistic nature about their killings. So of course, when you look at Echols, think about what I've just told you about his background, but also he had a real preference for wearing all black clothing. You know, he was a big fan of heavy metal music, Metallica in particular. Am I describing myself? Is this me? Like, I mean, come on. I love Metallica. I like heavy metal. At the end of the day, I like wearing black. I'm not about to go murder some children. Anybody listening to this, if you like Metallica or heavy metal, no, I don't think that you are a child killer. But it was one of these things that people started to make these weirdest. I was a goth. I was really kind. I'm an animal rights advocate, but I still liked wearing black. Still got the eyeliner, still a recovering goth. He was also interested in modern pagan religion of Wicca. I've been interested in the modern pagan religion of Wicca. A lot of us have. I like the idea of white witches. I like the idea of magic with a K. Doesn't make you a potential psychopath. But you can see how the MO is getting painted here. Oh, this is a kid who wears black, likes heavy metal. If you play the records backwards, it probably says kill children. That's where we are in time in 1993, okay? So he basically stands out like a sore thumb. He's in this really conservative Bible Belt area and he just does not fit in. I suppose that people would relate to him as being a bit of a wrong-un, someone who basically got involved in things that others would not find too palatable. I do have to bring in, though, one of his co-accused actually described Echols as being sick in the head. I don't know whether he was being literal, Maybe he was. Maybe the way that he said that was because he's saying that he'd been mentally unwell. You know, we can say he's saying sick in the head because he might go murder kids. But could it just have been he was relating to him as being unwell? Semantics are really important because if you look at that, oh, one of his co-accused said he's sick in the head, you instantly go, oh, right, so he's saying that this guy could have gone and done some really heinous things. But if you think about it on a more literal level, that his friend knows that he's been in a mental institution, he could just be saying Echols has been unwell mentally. Isn't it interesting how when you look at words that way and sentences that way, you can get completely different feelings about them dependent on the way that your bias is involved. Obviously, this is brilliant for the local police. Like, my God, we haven't just got a potential child killer. He looks like a potential child killer. That's what they're going to think, isn't it? So they believe at this point, straight away, he is more than capable of killing a child. Now, that preformed bias against Echols is going to have serious repercussions later on. You can't believe because somebody has been mentally unwell, because they might like doing ritualistic Wicca, you can't stretch to think that that would mean that they are somebody who's going to sacrifice children. It does not fit. But if you believe it fits and you're running the case, what are you going to do? You're going to take your eye off the ball everywhere else and you're going to place your focus on that individual. And that's where neutrality goes out of the window. And I know that people are like, well, do you have to have neutrality? Absolutely. Because if you walk into my room now and my husband's laid dead on the carpet and I'm stood with a knife covered in blood, you're going to go, she's done it. 80% of killings are by people that we know, right? I fit the MO in that way. If you don't then listen to what I'm telling you, if you don't look at the scene and realise that actually I walked in, withdrew that knife from my husband's chest, got covered in blood because his heart was still beating, and actually I wasn't involved, you're going to fit me up because of your bias, right? So they bring Echols in. He's basically interviewed by the police within 2 days of the murders. So that's May the 7th. Now at this point, they offer him a lie detector test and he agrees to it. I'm going to be really honest with you. I would never take a lie detector test. You're like, why, Emma? What are you saying? Are you secretly murdering people? And then if they asked you, you'd fail it? No, I would not take a lie detector test because I have said before, I would probably be found guilty because I get so nervous about those things. So nervous, it's unbelievable. So I would instantly be like, I'm not doing it. And then there is a second reason why. Lie detectors work at best 65% of the time. In my opinion, that means like tossing a coin. So I would refuse it. One, they're not admissible in court, but come on. If you fail it, the police are going to be like, bang to rights. But it's not true. In fact, if you want a polygraph to be effective, you need to be working with somebody who has got so much experience that they are almost a human lie detector too, so that you're working in tandem with them. If it's carried out by somebody who's not got the experience, if it's carried out by somebody who thinks they're good at it but don't really know how to do it properly, then the chances are it's not going to work out well for you, and it doesn't. Echols fails it. So at this point, the police have got that description, they think he's potentially the person who's guilty, and now they've got a lie detector that he's failed. That's not admissible in court, but you can bet your bottom dollar they are now believing it's definitely him. He denies any involvement. And even though the polygraph suggests he's lying, he continues to say that there is nothing involving him in this crime. But he does say a few things that are really suspicion arousing. And even from an objective perspective, I have to say if I was interviewing him, this would prick my interest and I would be like, it doesn't make sense what he's saying. First off, this is 2 days after the crime. Nothing's been released to the public regarding injuries. He refers to the fact that one of the boys' genitals has been mutilated. And he says that he also thinks that the killers would have urinated on the victims. That's a weird thing to say. Now we know, as I've said, Christopher's been castrated. And the autopsies that are carried out on the boys actually do reveal that 2 of the boys had urine in their stomachs. What does that say to you? That means that those boys were forcibly urinated in. They were basically made to swallow urine. Why would anybody think of saying that they would piss on kids who they killed? Why would that be a thought process? But Echols brings that forwards. Now, he claims later that he'd learned of the mutilation in news reports. And remember, a lot of these interviews, they weren't recorded. It's not like today. I mean, you can't do anything today. We've seen that in things like Jodi Arias. You can't do anything. Everything's on tape, right? But in 93, it wasn't like that. So Echols is able to say that the only reason he was saying that was because he heard about the mutilation in the news reports. Now, when he's asked about the urine comment, he basically says that that's what he would have done if he'd been the killer. Okay? I personally think that is a freaking strange comment to make. And if I was the copper, I'd be thinking, that feels like a very strange thing to say. And it also perfectly fits with what the autopsy has found. But what also contributed to this ongoing belief that Echols was involved in the crime was because he kept making public confessions. He kept saying that he was responsible for the murders. And it wasn't just at one place. So there's one incident, which is on May the 7th, that's the same day that he's questioned by the police. He's at a skating rink and witnesses overhear him telling a friend that he and his best friend Jason Baldwin were the ones who've done it. So that's overheard. So the following week at the skating rink, witnesses again overhear other kids talking about the fact that Echols had been involved in the murder of 3 boys. And more than that he's planning on killing again before turning himself into police. This is just hearsay. Remember that. Kids make shit up. Rumours spread. Children and young people also lie about what they've done. I'm not saying that this is an admission of reality. It could have been just boys saying things to score points, saying things to seem a little bit different, to stand out. But this is what's reported. Now, allegedly, Echols and Baldwin had also been openly bragging about being the ones responsible for the murders. So they together had been saying this. It wasn't just one of them. They were both talking about this openly. Then later on in that month, around the 27th of May, they both go to this softball game. And there are multiple witnesses at this point that say that the kids in the crowd were shouting at Echols about the murder of the boys. And then Echols was apparently shouting back at them, saying that he did it. So multiple witnesses say that. During this period, there is another chief suspect. The name keeps cropping up during the investigation. And this is of Jessie Misskelley Jr., 17 years old at the time. Police do feel that he's worth bringing in. So on June the 3rd, it's just about a month after the murders, he's brought in for questioning. Now let's look at Misskelley because it's important to do that. He's firstly a high school dropout. Secondly, he's got a real reputation for being quite violent, gets into fist fights constantly with local teenagers. He also is acquainted, not really close friends, but is acquainted with Echols. This is where the police really mess up. They make schoolboy errors, fundamental errors in the handling of Misskelley. Misskelley has an IQ of 72. That is very, very low. Developmentally impaired, probably very naive in the way that he trusts, very childlike, no doubt, in the way that he interacts with the world. Doesn't mean he's not dangerous. I'm saying when you have an IQ of just 72 and you are getting questioned by the police, they have a duty diligently to protect you. You might be a horrible killer, who knows? They have to protect you. They need to make sure that the counsel you receive is one that you understand. If they don't, nothing you say makes a difference because they can have it thrown out, rightfully so. To compound the fact that they've brought him in without thinking about this, they then interview him without the presence of a lawyer. Now, if you do that, that means that at some point down the line, the defence are going to be like, oh, hang on a minute. You were interviewed without a lawyer present. You've got an IQ of 72. What can we do here? We can say that you didn't understand your Miranda rights. Now, in the UK, we don't have Miranda rights, but obviously in the States, you do. and it's very similar to our police caution. Over here they say you do not have to say anything, but it may harm the defence if you do not mention when questioned something which you later rely on in court. In the States it's slightly different, but it basically means I understand that what I am saying now can be used against me in a court of law. If you don't understand that, you need somebody to be able to be present who understands that for you. That did not happen. The police pretty much from the get-go don't believe what Misskelley is saying. He says, I had nothing to do with the murders, I know nothing about it. But the police are pressing him about this. So he gets questioned further. And that's when his story starts to change. Again, he says, I had nothing to do with the killings, but I do know who did it. I've spoken to the people who did it on the phone. At that point, he identifies Echols and Baldwin as the perpetrators. He also goes on to further claim that they're in a satanic cult and that the boys have been killed in connection with this. Remember, satanic panic is rushing through the nation. This is going to play into that belief system, isn't it? Oh my God, this is satanic. This is real. And the police are going to get carried away with this idea. Another witness who really throws a spanner in the works is an older friend of Misskelley called Vicky Hutchison. Now, her son Aaron was actually a friend of the murdered boys. Now, she claims that she'd actually attended a Wiccan meeting with Misskelley and Echols, during which an inebriated Echols brags about killing the boys. So she's a direct witness at this point. Now, I'm going to be honest, none of what she said can be corroborated, and with respect, she retracts her statement. She actually retracts it later on, saying that she just wanted to claim the reward. There was a large amount of money that was available if it led to the arrest of the perpetrators, and she saw that she could get it, and she made it all up, which is heinous if that's the case, and she should have been in serious trouble for doing that, wasting police time, directing a case in the wrong direction, potentially leading to the incarceration of innocent young people. Of course, that's a massive crime in my opinion. Anyway, the more that the police question Misskelley, it feels like the more his story evolves. Again, we've got to be understanding, should that happen? You know, if you're getting questioned constantly, when you're very low IQ, without proper counsel, and your story is getting more and more embellished, on one level, it could be that you're just telling the truth. On another level, it could be that you're exhausted, you're getting coerced, you're feeling under pressure to give the police what they want. Remember, police are very good at making you feel comfortable, scared. You've got a friend and a foe, maybe if you've got two of them interviewing you. In the end, you just allow yourself to say whatever it is that they want to hear because you know you're exhausted or they're making promises to you. So that could all be going on. But at this point, he does confess. He says, okay, I did. I played an active role in the boys' killing. I didn't get as involved as the other two. You know, he downplays his part, but I did get involved in it. So this is what he said played out. This is how he says the day went. He meets Echols and Baldwin on May the 5th. That's the day of the murders. He meets them at Lakeshore Trailer Park. That's where Baldwin lives. And then they walk across to Robin Hood Hills. Now later on, obviously, Stevie, Michael and Christopher arrive at the Pipe Bridge on the bikes. At this point, he says Echols calls them across. So Misskelley and Baldwin, whilst Echols calls them across, are hidden undergrowth. So they're lying in wait for them. So Misskelley says they leave the bikes on the far side of the bridge and they cross over. Think about being 8 years of age and these older boys are calling you over. You go, don't you? One, you're like, hey, these older guys want to talk to me. Two, you might be a bit afraid. I've got to go because these older guys are telling me to go. And probably intrigued. Go and hang out with some older kids. I have to say those bikes would later be found in the water beneath the bridge, having been tossed in. So it is consistent with where they actually would have left the bikes. Misskelley then claims that they made their way down to Devil's Den, where he said Echols and Baldwin then started this physical attack on all three of the boys, just on the banks of the ditch. Misskelley insinuated that he didn't take part in the attack, but he was stood at the top of the slope watching, and he watched those events unfold, which must have been horrifying if it was the case. He did slip up quite a lot during the questioning, and that's why the police believe that he played a much more active role. One of the things that Misskelley stated that Echols and Baldwin first did was beat the boys with their fists, and then Echols got a stick. It was about the size of a baseball bat. I remember that is the size of that stick that they found with the t-shirt on it. So it was about the size of a baseball bat, and he had this particular focus on Christopher. He was beating him around the head in particular. Now, an autopsy on Christopher did reveal that he had multiple fractures to his skull, remember? So again, that is consistent. So after beating the boys, Misskelley then claims that Echols and Baldwin stripped them naked before holding them down and getting to work on them with a knife that Baldwin allegedly always carried. Misskelley then states that Baldwin cuts one of the boys' faces with the blade. Again, that is consistent with what appears to be a serious laceration to the left side of Stevie's face, so it is fitting. And then he claimed to see Baldwin use the knife on Christopher's groin area. Now again, that is consistent with the fact that Christopher had appeared to be castrated. So I want you to imagine this scene that Misskelley is describing. These children watching this play out in front of themselves, being horribly brutalised this way. And it kind of gets worse in my head because Misskelley then says that one of the boys, Michael, had actually tried to run away and that he had physically chased him down and held him to stop him escaping. And it's then that Echols and Baldwin take hold of him, beat him too. They then strip him naked as well. Now, again, I'm going to say this proved to be consistent with the location of the bodies when they were discovered by police, because Michael's body was found over 20 feet away from those of his friends. Again, later, Misskelley would also tell his lawyer that Echols had actually gone down on one of the boys and appeared to bite his penis. When they did the autopsy, showed Stevie did appear to have an injury on the tip of his penis, as though someone had either bitten it or pinched it. Just telling you what the autopsy said. Now, consequently, evidence would be submitted at a later hearing in the form of notes taken by Misskelley's attorney during a meeting with his client, which added further issues around the possibility of a sexual element to the murders. Basically, Misskelley said that he saw that Echols and Baldwin both went over to the boys after they'd beaten them and performed oral sex on them and then anally sodomized them. This is from Misskelley. He also said that Michael had been beaten unconscious and that when he'd been completely beaten unconscious, Damien went over, pulled down his pants and again sodomized him. Misskelley isn't consistent. His story changes all the time because later on he actually says that didn't happen, that Echols and Baldwin didn't actually penetrate their victims, but more that they simulated the motions of anal rape on them. Nonetheless, harrowing information to be talking about, isn't it? So Misskelley tells them that all three boys were unconscious when Echols and Baldwin tie them up and drag them into the waters and throw them into the ditch. But later, however, I'm going to say, Misskelley changes his story again, and it's even more harrowing because he says that when they threw them in the water, Christopher and Michael were still alive and that they were kicking about in the water, but he couldn't help them because he was too afraid of the other boys. He was afraid that Echols and Baldwin would attack him. So we go from the boys are unconscious to the boys are completely conscious, horribly injured, kicking and screaming as they are thrown in the water to their final deaths. Now, as well as his confession to police, family and friends of Misskelley do report that after the murders, he starts acting a whole heap of strange. He makes a lot of references to the boys' deaths before he's even questioned by the police, and that in his family's eyes does concern them because they feel that there is some implication there that he knew something about the crime. In fact, one of his friends, Buddy Lucas, is given a pair of trainers by Misskelley. So Buddy Lucas has been given these trainers and it starts to play in his mind some of the things that he was told by Misskelley, and he actually talks to his family about it and they're like, you have to go and speak to the police. So he goes back to the police and he actually says to them, look, what Misskelley told me was that Echols and Baldwin had hurt these boys, that he had wanted to go and tell the police about this, but he was really scared because he thought in telling them he'd go to prison too. He did admit to taking part in the beatings, and he also admitted to chasing one of the boys who tried to escape. This is what his friend has told him that Misskelley has told him. He said that Misskelley had given him the trainers because he'd worn them on the nights of the killings and he didn't ever want to see them again. So these are friends of Misskelley, and they're coming forward and saying his behaviour has changed significantly and he's also given away these trainers, and he's told his friend this information. Misskelley's family also say that it's around this point that he starts experiencing horrific night terrors, has unexplained crying fits, terrible nightmares, and in retrospect, what experts said was it is displaying the classic symptoms of PTSD, because he's obviously witnessed this horrific event. At least this is what we're led to believe at this point. And if you think about what Misskelley's told the police, well, it would make sense, right? If you had actually watched 3 children brutalized, sodomized, beaten to a pulp and drowned, you are going to be traumatized if you were at least somebody with a point of conscience. So due to the nature of some of the injuries suffered by the boys and the details of Misskelley's confession, police suspected that a knife had been used in the attack. And one of the things that they're now interested to do is to find the weapon. So they start searching the homes of 3 of the suspects. Now, Baldwin's home backs onto a large lake, and the police think, if I'm going to get rid of a knife, a large lake is a pretty good place to dispose of a murder weapon, right? So accordingly, in November 1993, divers go and search the area of the lake, which is directly behind Baldwin's home, and within hours, they've unearthed a survival knife. This became known as the lake knife. Now, from where the knife was located, it was pretty easy to establish that it could have been thrown only from a pier directly behind Baldwin's home. So they kind of know this is a knife that very likely is linked to Baldwin. Now, furthermore, the knife itself had a regular flat blade on one of the edges, and it also had a serrated blade on the other. That seemed to be consistent with the injuries suffered by the victims, because from the indentations made on the boys' bodies, police had been looking for a knife with a serrated edge. So the survival knife recovered from the lake seems to be a perfect match. The serrated edge matched markings on the boys' bodies to fractions of a millimetre. Fractions of a millimetre. And this is particularly true when you look at the mutilation injury to Christopher's groin, because what appeared to be serrated indentations were clearly apparent on the boy's inner thigh. And the prosecution claimed that this had been caused when the knife was pressed into the thigh during the act of castration. Now, because I want to be as neutral as possible in this, I'm going to bring in both sides, because I'm telling you now, there were lots of allegations against the police. As far as people are concerned, that knife had been planted by the police. That's what the defence said. And it wasn't just the defence, there was a lot of people who did believe that the police were fitting these kids up. You know, they wanted to find the murderers. They believed that these boys were the murderers, and therefore they had put this particular piece of evidence in the lake to make it seem that they were guilty. In the end, it was ultimately accepted that it probably had belonged to Baldwin, because lots of people knew he possessed loads of weapons like that. But there are lots of conflicting accounts as how it ended up in the lake, and different witnesses gave different reasons for this. Baldwin's mother even took responsibility for it. She said, I threw it into the lake around a year before the murders because a child in the family was playing with it and they cut themselves, so I threw it in the lake to stop there being any more problems with it. I'm going to be honest with you, I think it's a bit of a weird explanation, but nonetheless, that's what she said. But then she changes her account and says, no, actually, it was Baldwin, it was my son who threw the knife in the lake. But then after that, she said, actually, no, it wasn't me or my son. It was the police trying to frame my son. I don't know which one was true. I just know that it doesn't really help anybody's defense if you're going to keep changing your story. You know, if you're going to lie, just stick to it, man. If you say that you threw it into the water yourself, stick to that story. Don't change it. It does nothing to defend your child. It does nothing to help the defence's case. Simple as that. An ex-boyfriend of Baldwin's mum will also give a statement later on saying that he'd seen the knife himself in Baldwin's home. But the problem with that is he'd only started the relationship with his mother a few months before the murders. So by that time, we've got Baldwin's mum already claiming that the knife is in the lake. So it's really conflicting, right? It's so confusing. It feels like in this case, misinformation and disinformation are just plentiful, and the police had a hell of a hard time establishing what was the truth, what was truth from fiction, essentially. And that must have been a nightmare. This is a small police task force. Yes, they're getting help from other local constabularies, but the point is they are in a situation where people keep shifting their stories, and that's a nightmare. Now, ultimately, no matter how confusing this is, no matter how much misinformation, no matter how much speculation, no matter how much anecdotal or circumstantial evidence that is being presented, the police do feel that they've got sufficient evidence to charge 3 suspects with multiple counts of murder and to take the case to court. And I'm going to be honest, prosecutors agreed straight away. It wasn't a hard one. They were like, yep, these kids did it. Now, in US law, there is a rule called the Bruton rule. Now, that states that a confession by a defendant cannot be admitted in evidence against his co-defendants. Now, because of this, Misskelley was tried separately to Echols and Baldwin. Both hearings took place in 1994. Misskelley was ultimately found guilty of 1 count of first-degree murder and 2 counts of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to life plus 40 years in prison. Baldwin and Echols were found guilty a few weeks later of 3 counts of murder. Baldwin was given a life sentence, whilst Echols was given the death penalty to be administered by lethal injection. So, different sentences were given. 1, the death penalty. That's a big deal. This kid's 18. You know, you've got to make sure that that's right. It's not enough that he's into Wicca and that he wears black and he likes Megadeth and has great taste in music. It's not enough. It's not enough that he had mental health issues. It's not enough. You have to make sure, beyond reasonable doubt, that this person is responsible for the murder of 3 children if you are going to put them to death by lethal injection. From here, appeals begin. Several appeals. And every single one of them is refused. So when I'm talking about Byers, really important to hear that. They're not even granted an appeal. Now, this is where people start getting interested. I don't know whether it's because these kids just hadn't been given or afforded a fair trial as far as people are concerned. I don't know whether it was because people could see that judgments had been made on, shall we say, flimsy evidence to some degree, and that it was more about the way that they looked, where they came from, what their lifestyles had been like, that had actually premeditated that they were going to get guilty. But it begins to really gather momentum and documentaries start getting made. They focus on the inadequacies of the police investigation, the flawed nature of some of the key evidence used to convict the defendants, and subsequently, the cause of West Memphis 3, as they've become known, has been taken up by celebrities all over the world, in Hollywood, in the music industry. I mean, some of the notable figures who've got involved in this case in trying to get these boys freed include director Peter Jackson and his wife, actor Johnny Depp, singer Eddie Vedder. Also, you've got the Henry Rollins Band. All of these people get on this bandwagon feeling that a grave miscarriage of justice has occurred. Now, one of the main arguments for that later is raised by the defence team in support of an appeal, and a point absolutely championed by supporters of the West Memphis 3, was that the prosecution's contention that certain injuries had been caused to the boys with a knife was wrong, and that they had, in fact, been caused by animal predation. So, animals feeding on the bodies post-mortem, so to speak. Now, the defence claimed that the mutilation that happened around Christopher's groin and to Stevie's face was consistent with the marks caused by the beaks and claws of snapper turtles, which they claimed were indigenous to the area. And if you've ever seen a snapper turtle, wow, they snap. They really do snap. Now, again, I want to be neutral here. Others have disputed this. They've said that no turtles have ever been seen in the ditchwater at Devil's Den. I find it really strange that these arguments about animal predation were not first considered and raised at the original trials, because surely that would have been something really helpful for the defence. If they could evidence, even show a snapper turtle at the scene, then that's going to change the perspective of the jury, which would be really important to do. So there is all of this intrigue and mystery around what really went on. So now all of these high-profile, high-net-worth individuals start getting involved. Donations are given from celebrity campaigns. Lots of new experts are appointed to argue that there had, in fact, been no knife used in the commission of the attack on the boys, and that what actually appeared to be knife injuries had actually been caused after the children had died by the animals. So this starts to get real momentum. So despite these new arguments coming in, and obviously very powerful arguments, still a lot of people contend that the evidence supporting the use of a knife does remain strong. So let's think about that. We have got the imprints left by the serrated edge of the knife, and also, it's got to be noted, one of the boys' shoelaces had been sliced in half so that they could hog tie them. So a knife was used. Also, irrespective of the fact that it could be the animals that had carried out those particular injuries after death, there do appear to be defence injuries on Michael's hand, and that looks like it's consistent with a knife attack. Now, another argument put forward by the defence team after the trials was that what appeared to be a circular bite on Stevie's forehead did not match dental impressions of any of the three defendants. And that's a powerful piece of evidence, isn't it? However, again, to be neutral, it was actually argued by the prosecution that those marks were a perfect match for the butt of the knife, which contained a compass and which was circular, so it could be screwed off. And that actually revealed a compartment to place matches. So you can actually see that it does fit accurately with the indentation. It also has this central metal pin. And again, when you look at the injuries on Stevie's forehead, it does actually match that. I'm not saying it was that, I'm saying that the prosecution argued that, and it did seem to fit consistently with what the injuries were. Now, a big problem about when the murders took place in 1993 is that DNA profiling was just nowhere near as advanced as it is today. Furthermore, the vast majority of DNA evidence had been destroyed. You know, like I said earlier on, if you want to destroy evidence, water is where you're going to do it. You know, those boys' bodies had been left in a ditch of water. So it's very difficult to get DNA evidence. Now, the defence team, obviously, because they want an appeal, they argued there's no DNA evidence connecting any of our defendants to the murder scene. That's a really important point to know. You've convicted and you've sentenced somebody to death, and you don't even have any evidence that they were there. However, I'm going to say this as well because I want to be neutral. I just want to present you the evidence from both the prosecution and the defence. So what opponents have said is that the DNA stuff isn't strictly true. Echols and Baldwin shared a necklace with a really distinctive axe-shaped pendant. And when they analysed the chain, it indicated that it contained traces of two people's blood. One turned out to be Echols himself, and it transpired that Stevie was a very probable match for the second individual. Furthermore, there was DNA evidence of two people found on the ligatures used to tie Stevie. One transpired to be Stevie's, whilst Echols was identified as a potential match for the second. So again, it conflicts, it confuses. We're back in, did they definitely do it? In 2004, however, in light of advances in DNA profiling, the Supreme Court allows DNA testing of the genetic evidence recovered from the victims and the crime scene, and none was found to match DNA from Echols, Baldwin, or Misskelley. And this is where it gets even more interesting. It did, however, potentially link Stephen Branch's stepfather, Terry Hobbs, and a man named David Jacoby, who'd been with Hobbs when the boys disappeared. So Stevie's stepfather's DNA is found. I know, curiouser and curiouser, right? So obviously now we've got so much evidence that's being brought to light that is throwing this original conviction into disarray. We've got all of these celebrities fighting for these boys' freedoms, now men's freedoms. We've got new evidence coming to light saying, well, actually the DNA evidence doesn't fit that they were at the scene. And even more intrigue, we've got one of the boys' stepfathers and his friend's DNA being found at the scene. Again, I'm not saying that the stepfather and his friend was guilty. Hey, when you're a stepfather, I guess your child's gonna have DNA material of you on them. I mean, you see them all the time. I'm not saying they're guilty. I'm just saying what we do know is that the guys who were in prison for this, there is no DNA actually linking them to the crime in spite of what has been said before. Because when they looked at the DNA earlier, the blood samples weren't direct matches, they were close matches. And as we've got better at DNA, we can tell that that isn't actually a direct link. So in 2010, all this is going on still, and they're deciding whether we need to invalidate the original conviction. But before it gets to a point where that happens, they agree a plea deal. The West Memphis 3, who by this time have spent over 18 years in prison, they agree a plea deal. Now, I would have struggled to accept this plea deal if I'd been one of them. I really would have, because I wouldn't have found it fair. So they're permitted to enter what is known in US law as an altered plea. Basically, what this means is they plead not guilty to all charges, but they say, yeah, okay, we weren't guilty, but we do accept that the evidence the state brought was adequate enough to convict us. So basically they're saying we're completely innocent, but you bastards had such evidence that it makes sense the jury convicted us. I would have really struggled with that. They also agreed not to pursue a civil claim for the wrongful imprisonment against the state. Again, I would have struggled with that. I was like, you bastards are going to pay me a sum that is going to mean that I never have to work a day in my life. You stole my freedom, you write that paycheck. That's the way I would have felt. But then I haven't been in prison for 18 years. Maybe they would have signed anything to get out. At that point, they were then re-sentenced, even though they were not guilty, to 18 years and 78 days. That's the amount of time that they'd already served. And they walked free from prison on the 19th of August, 2011. That must have been a very bittersweet moment. All those years considered child murderers, child mutilators, one of you facing the death penalty every day. Imagine, Echols could have been put to death by lethal injection by now. And then another man would have gone to his death wrongly convicted, potentially. Now, after they come out, Echols is quite a charismatic individual. He's quite a confident, some would say quite arrogant. I'm not going to deny it. There is a little bit of aloof arrogance to him. But hey, he's got a right, I suppose, to be really pissed off. He says this statement, I am innocent, as are Jason and Jessie. But I made this decision because I did not want to spend another day of my life behind those bars. I want to live and to continue to fight for our innocence. You know, whilst many support the West Memphis 3 and absolutely believe that this case demonstrates a really horrible miscarriage of justice, including some of the members of the victims' families, I'll be honest, others feel that 3 men have got away with murder. It's still one of those that causes debate, even though, as I said, some of the members of the actual victims' families feel that those boys were sent to prison unjustly. And I don't think you can get enough validation of your innocence than when the families of the victims say, these boys were innocent. But still, there are a lot of people who believe that the damning confessions of Misskelley mean that they were actually guilty. So let's look at those confessions. So the first was to his friend, Buddy Lucas. The second to police on June the 3rd. 3 separate confessions to his lawyer, his own lawyer. Another confession to the driver who was taking him to prison after his conviction. Also, confession to prosecution lawyers. And this is the one that kind of gets me a little bit. Misskelley's cellmate claimed that he confessed to the crime to him on multiple occasions and had described the horrific events in graphic detail, disturbing his cellmate so much that he wrote to the prosecutors begging them, in light of a possible appeal, that Misskelley, Echols and Baldwin should never be released. I can only tell you what was sent to the prosecutors. But Misskelley's cellmate was traumatised by the information he was told. Again, This is a man with an IQ of 72. Is it possible that he was coerced and convinced by the police? Did he start questioning his own sanity? When you're privy to all this horrific traumatic detail, does that become part of your story? You know, it's very easy to manipulate people who have needs, who are vulnerable. So again, as much as that seems damning, let's just think about a guy with an IQ of 72, constantly being told about what's happened, basically being told that he was a part of it, starting to believe the things that he's seeing and being told in front of him, looking at pictures that are damaging and traumatizing. Do you start to own that belief system? I'm just throwing it out there. It is possible, isn't it? So obviously the opponents of the West Memphis 3 look at these details, these confessions, and they argue that basically only the killers could have known those facts. Again, specifically, they point out things like Misskelley named 2 suspects in the murders who, like him, had no alibis. He claimed that one of them had a knife and the injuries suffered by 2 of the boys are consistent with lacerations caused by a bladed weapon. He knew the exact location of the murders. He knew that the victims left their bikes before entering Robin Hood Hills. He knew that the victims were severely beaten. He knew that the sticks were used to beat the victims. He knew that Christopher and Stevie were both mutilated with a knife. He also correctly described each of those injuries. He knew that Michael had attempted to escape, which is obviously consistent with the body being found 20 feet away from the other 2. He knew that the boys were naked and tied up. And he also knew that their bodies had been left in a ditch of water. That's quite compelling, right? Now, also, it is worth mentioning, because America does have some pretty steep laws, I'm not going to lie. You get into trouble in the States, you're in trouble. It's not like in the UK where they're like life and it's 12 years. I mean, that's not life, is it? Like, that is not life. I'm just saying it. It does my head in when they're like, you've got a life sentence, I'll see you in 8 years with good behaviour. You know, at the time, the state law in Arkansas meant that children were treated in the same way as adults if they were suspected of a crime and taken in by police for questioning. Minors who were questioned about serious crimes, so basically crimes that could result in a life sentence if they were later found guilty, they are presumed to be as competent as adults. Yet, and this is so ironic, the same children would need permission of their parents to get their ears pierced. It's a bit bizarre, isn't it? We can question you for murder on your own, even if you're a child, but you will be breaking the law if you go and have your ears pierced. Doesn't make sense, does it? But it's the way it is. So it's this state of affairs that basically leads to the questionable confessions obtained by Misskelley. He's got a really low IQ. He's questioned for hours and hours without his parents or a lawyer present. And Misskelley said, I was bloody terrified. I was scared to death of the police. They questioned me for 12 hours. I was intimidated. They used veiled threats. I was exhausted. These are all things that contribute to people making false confessions. I agree. I'm not going to, for 1 minute, disagree with the fact. Misskelley's confession is incredibly damning. It is, isn't it? I'm going to describe exactly what happened, where it happened, the injuries, how they died. You know, it's pretty damning. And it's also damning for his accomplices. We are never going to know, are we, what actually went on in that police interrogation room. We don't know how much he was pressured. We don't know how much information he was told. What we do know is at the end of it, he confessed. And because things weren't recorded, we have no idea what he was signing up to. He probably didn't even know what was being written down. Now, he also says that whilst he was read his rights, he just didn't have a clue what they were on about. He didn't understand the significance of them, and that makes sense. He was a very low IQ. He was terrified. He didn't know what was going on. I completely empathise with the fact that that would be true. He wouldn't realise what was going on. So ultimately, he retracted his statement. But in spite of the fact that legally and rightfully he retracted his statement, at trial, the court was like, yeah, we don't care. You gave that voluntarily, we're going to use it. That's going to really cause an issue, isn't it? Because suddenly they've got this in-depth detail of information basically identifying exactly what happened in perfect synchronicity with the crime and the individual saying that he was there. As a juror, that's going to be really, really influencing. I'm not going to see all the coercion, force, threat that took place in that interview. I'm just going to look at the black and white details and going to be like, these guys are guilty as hell. Even worse is that even though that particular evidence should not have had any influence in the trial of Echols and Baldwin, i.e. it shouldn't have been able to be used, the jury were overheard discussing Misskelley's damning statements at Echols and Baldwin's trial, even though it was specifically excluded in their trial. So we've got a massive bias, haven't we? So as far as I'm concerned, and as far as people who've looked into this case are concerned, this inadmissible evidence was key. It's what helped the jury reach their unanimous guilty verdicts. Because you would, wouldn't you? It doesn't matter that it's not been put into the trial that you're listening to. You've heard about it. Everybody knows it's a small area. You are going to be aware, and that will create such a bias in your mind. It's also worth mentioning, as I said at the very beginning, that the police investigation has been absolutely criticised beyond belief. The crime scene was trampled, vital evidence was destroyed. Furthermore, the police delayed several hours before even sending for the coroner. So they get the boys' bodies out of the water and they leave them on the bank in the sunlight. I mean, if you want to ruin evidence, get the bodies out, leave them in UV rays. And that means that the coroner can't even accurately tell you what the time of death is. And it also means that the body is decaying. So they have gone out of their way to make the biggest royal fuck up as far as making sure that these bodies are preserved for forensic analysis. There's also failure on the police's part to prevent sensitive information about the case getting into the hands of the media. Whenever you get things in the hand of the media, you jeopardise the likelihood of a fair trial further down the line. It is a real bugbear with me. I know the media wants stories, but back off. Because you telling those stories might get innocent people convicted or might get guilty people off. It happens all the time. It's wrong. In all honesty, let's be honest, it's likely that no consensus is ever going to be reached about this case. There is a massively fierce debate over the evidence and the guilt of the Memphis Three, and it's going to continue forever. There's been so much time that's passed, so much evidence has gone astray. And let's be honest as well, important witnesses forget crucial details. So I'm going to ask you a question, guys. How do you feel about this? You know, is this the case that the police had the true culprits all along? And yeah, the investigation was flawed, but at the end of the day, justice prevailed in convicting the West Memphis Three? Or is it instead the case that the police felt under incredible pressure to quickly apprehend those responsible and make a community and a nation feel safe again? Did police find 3 suspects who perfectly fitted the kind of people they were looking for and build a case around them to fit this horrific crime? Or is the true perpetrator or perpetrators still walking free? You know, some forensic experts looking at the DNA, they do maintain the belief that they got the right people convicted, but they also concede that if there were to be a retrial, they were probably acquitted due to the existence of reasonable doubt. Remember, that's what we always have to go for, yeah? Is there reasonable doubt? And if there is, you have to acquit. Who knows? I think this is one of those cases where you have this vitriolic support on both sides. You know, you have supporters and opponents of the West Memphis Three, and they believe they are either fully innocent or fully guilty. And there is just like this sheer documentation pertaining to the case. There's plethora of witnesses providing contradictory testimony over the years, which makes establishing what really happened on the evening in May 1993 a near impossibility. And the thing is, neither side seem happy with the ultimate outcome. Those in support of the West Memphis Three argue that they should receive a pardon, and that those against arguing that they've effectively got away with murder. Now, I'm going to be really honest with you guys. I, for one, would certainly not claim to have a definitive opinion as to their innocence or guilt. Those involved in the case, all experts in their respective field, they aren't even able to agree. The one thing I know for sure, though, is that there are 3 undeniable victims in this case. 3 innocent little boys. 3 innocent little boys who lost their lives in the most senseless and brutal of ways. And their families are all serving their own personal life sentences. And I guess as I end this, the one thing that I want to say is that in the midst of all this media hype surrounding the murders on Robin Hood Hills, whilst we obviously concentrate focus to some degree on the men who were apparently innocent of those crimes, the one thing that we must never forget are those 3 innocent little boys, Christopher, Michael and Stevie. Because often it's the victims who we forget. Those children had the rest of their lives to live. They had adventures to go on, directions to go in, people to meet, to grow, marriages that should have been, and they will never be. And it's so paramount that all of us take a moment to just remember that they are those who don't have a voice anymore. And even though there is so much dispute, argument, issues around this case, the fact that there is still so much interest gives them legacy, doesn't it? Because most of us agree that child murder is the most heinous occurrence. And let's hope that one day, whoever is guilty for the murder of those 3 gorgeous boys is brought to justice. I'm not sure how you feel at the end of that. Like I said, I'm completely neutral. It's not my job to decide innocence or guilt, but what I wanted to do in this one was to kind of show you just how conflictual the evidence is and also how enormous the evidence is. And I'm kind of glad that those guys are out. I really am. But I'm very upset that we haven't got the individuals in prison who did actually take the lives of those poor kids. I hope you found this interesting. I know it's a long one, but there was so much and I wanted to create this neutrality. Sometimes when somebody's banged to rights, I'm really happy to just go down on the fact that they are guilty or they are innocent. But in this one, I felt there was so much information that I needed to bring it together in a little bit more of a non-biased way, which is unusual for me, isn't it? Because I like to be really biased a lot of the time. But like I said, I do think that the decision to let those men out was the right decision because I do not think they got a fair trial. And I do think that there was reasonable doubt. And that is basis of what law is about. That's about justice. And they got it in that respect. Join me next time for another True Crime with me, Emma Kenny. If you have enjoyed this and you haven't seen me before, I've got a massive back catalogue now. Get back, binge watch. It's free. And if you haven't subscribed, make sure you do. See you again next time.